If a practice or technology requires perpetual subsidy, that's probably not going to be a lasting solution, right? Because there isn't necessarily the balance sheet within one company, let alone a food system and a commodities-based business, to take on additional costs. So we're really interested in how do we improve the economics of the system, along the way reducing the carbon intensity of food production.
JBS Foods is one of the world's leading food companies, specializing in beef, pork, and chicken products. With operations in over 15 countries, they supply food to more than 190 nations globally. In 2023, JBS generated approximately $72.9 billion in global revenue. While the company is widely recognized for its scale in meat production, JBS is also prioritizing sustainability by reducing its environmental impact and investing in innovative solutions to meet the growing demand for more responsible food production. At the Concordia Annual Summit in New York City, we had the opportunity to sit down with JBS Global Chief Sustainability Officer, Jason Weller, to dive into the challenges of Scope 3 emissions and managing a complex supply chain. Imagine a supply chain where you are sourcing materials from 70,000 individual companies. For a company like JBS, where 97% of emissions come from Scope 3, it is incredibly complex to drive that number down because these are indirect emissions outside of their direct control. JBS has committed to becoming net zero by 2040, a goal that highlights the urgency of educating ranchers and farmers on sustainability. Without their full participation, JBS will face significant challenges in meeting its climate commitments. Throughout this conversation, we discussed the complexities of the supply chain of one of the world's largest food processing companies and how JBS plans to reduce emissions and hit its ambitious 2040 net zero target. Well, welcome back to the Green Hour. We are here at the Concordia Annual Summit in New York City during Climate Week, and I'm sitting here with Jason Weller, the Global Chief Sustainability Officer for JBS Foods. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I think this conversation, the majority of it's going to be around indirect emissions, right? Scope 3 emissions. And, in today's day and age, everyone's trying to figure out how can I eliminate emissions and drive them down as much as possible. But when we're talking about Scope 3 and indirect emissions, it's a little bit more challenging, right? Because that's not under your roof. But before we get into that, I'll just ask, could you tell us what JBS Foods is, the scope of the organization, and then some of the cool stuff you're doing in sustainability?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of the dialogue and conversation. It's really great you're hosting this during Climate Week and allowing companies like JBS to be part of the conversation. So JBS, just for folks that are viewing and listening, we are a global diversified food company. So we were founded in Brazil 70 years ago. Today, we're one of the largest food companies in the world. We're generally not a consumer-facing branded company. We actually supply thousands of customers globally. So we operate across 6 continents. We have operations in over 25 countries, 600 facilities. We're predominantly known for our main proteins. So we're basically a protein company, beef, pork, and chicken, but we're also in salmon, plant-based protein, cultivated meat. So really a diversified portfolio of different proteins, and we're a prepared foods company. So we have operations in Oceania, in Australia, Brazil, North America from Mexico, US, and Canada, and then across Western Europe. So my role, I serve as the Global Sustainability Officer for JBS. So I'm based here in the United States. I work on a daily basis with our sustainability teams across that operations. And then critically, this conversation on Scope 3 supply chain. And that's where I spend 98% of my time, because 98% of my time is actually Scope 3 in that dialogue. So how do we then partner with the food system, farmers, our suppliers, our customers downstream of us, and bring together a full system solution?
Yeah, it's got to be difficult, right? I mean, I looked at y'all's ESG report, 2023, 97% of emissions were indirect Scope 3 emissions. So again, these are things that they're in your control, but these are your suppliers, right? These are, it's not energy inside a building or a manufacturing facility. So it's a little bit different. So, I mean, that's got to be challenging though, trying to figure out how to drive that down.
It's hugely challenging. It's really complex. And as part of the conversation this week we're trying to have with folks is that I think, yes, it's important to have vision. It's important to have ambition. absolutely, we're in a climate emergency. So all hands on deck. What's not generally part of the conversation, though, are the microeconomics. And so, yes, there are solutions and ideas around food system interventions, but what's often lost in that is just sort of basic business common sense and microeconomics. And so that's what we're really trying to focus on at JBS, is starting first with our farmer suppliers. What are different systems and practices that we can hopefully educate and bring to them, whether ourselves or through trusted partners and advisors, that really drive their economic success? If you can marry together their profitability, their productivity, with also climate mitigation, with climate adaptation, that's where you start to get adoption and you get that sustainability, if you will, of the practice. If a practice or technology requires perpetual subsidy, that's probably not going to be a lasting solution, right? Because there isn't necessarily the balance sheet within one company, let alone a food system and a commodities-based business, to take on additional costs. So we're really interested in how do we improve the economics of the system, along the way reducing the carbon intensity of food production.
Well, that's why I love this conference. I was actually telling the guys earlier, I was like, you might go to some other climate conferences in New York during this week, and what makes this one different is almost every conversation I've had with someone in sustainability, it's been kind of circled around economics. How can we get the economics to work? Because in the environmental movement, I'll say, it's got to make economic sense. If it doesn't, then you're not going to be able to scale it. You're not going to be able to do what you need to do and get people behind you and get the funding really behind you.
Yeah. Have to have a strong business case. You have to have an evident market, and you have to have clear market signals. And without those necessary ingredients to kind of a real economy solution, I think there's a lot of different innovations and technologies that have kind of gone before that. But if they don't have that business case or a clear signal or evident demand, it's not going to be a lasting solution. So that's where, again, what's the, I hate to use a cliche, but the win-win, where you're addressing the economics of the system, but also addressing the environmental health and quality of the system.
So I think all of us, everyone listening to this has been to a grocery store before, has walked in, picked up, beef, pork, poultry, whatever it is. But a lot of people don't think back to where that first started and where it originated. And my question I have for you is, when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, one of them is methane, right? And in the cattle and beef production industry, I mean, that's a big greenhouse gas emission that you have to kind of look at. So my question would be, how does JBS Foods look at methane and figure out how to reduce it when, again, this is scope 3 and this is the farmers that you're working with?
Yeah. So there's a double barrel thing I want to go out here.
Yeah.
So one, definitely want to talk about methane for sure. But then two, what we're also interested in, I think, is a more nuanced conversation, particularly around beef production, cattle production. So I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
On methane specifically. 100% of the agri-food system is a huge source of emissions. It's a nature-based system that harnesses the carbon cycle to produce, it transforms the sun energy into chemical energy, which we call food. As part of that production system, you're going to have natural emissions, whether methane, CO2, some nitrous oxide from that system. Methane specifically out of cattle production, yes. So we have done, starting with enteric, everyone's favorite, cow burps, everyone's favorite topic. We have done large-scale trials with different rumen manipulation, feed additive trials in Brazil, everything from seaweeds to tannins to 3-NOP, Bovaer. We understand how these additives work, how they attenuate emissions, but we also then, I hate to come back to it, about economics. We also understand the economics of these systems. And we've learned, when you're introducing cost into whether it's cattle production, feed production, hog production, doesn't really matter. If you're adding cost to that system without then improving the economics, the performance, or the quality of the product, it's going to be difficult to scale. So we have done large scale trials. We understand how these additives work. But we also then, coming back to the economics, we're really excited about other ways to attenuate methane, which is probably a little more counterintuitive. So there's, I guess, direct reductions, then there's economic reductions. So the Food and Ag Organization, FAO, put out a report about a year ago where they looked at 11 different categories of interventions of how to lower the carbon intensity of livestock production, animal protein. The top 5 interventions, productivity gains on the animal, feed and nutrition solutions, animal care and animal health, breeding and genetics, and then an indirect benefit is carbon sequestration back into pastures and soils. all 5 of those, the top 5 interventions, the most effective for attenuating carbon intensity from cattle production or other livestock, have a direct economic benefit back to the farm and ranch. That's where we're focused at JBS. How do we bring back to the ranch, improve pasture management, improve grazing management systems, soil health systems, nutrient solutions, precision nutrient application technologies. So through that system, you're reducing the carbon intensity and boosting productivity per acre, per hectare, per unit. That's where we believe, a joint economic gain, boosting food security and productivity, while also attenuating gases like methane. If I could come back though to the cattle conversation, it's also a really important point. I think it's lost in this conversation, just focusing in the United States. And I'm super passionate of this because in part, my first job out of college, I didn't grow up in agriculture. I grew up in coastal California, hitting the sets, didn't understand jack about agriculture. My first job out of college was on a cow-calf operation in Montana. And there I learned what it meant to make a living off the land, working with a cattle operation. My whole career has been kind of with the family there in terms of how do we help them keep the ranch. In that, there's this sustainability resiliency conversation that gets lost. And in media, and there are a lot of concerns, understandably, about the carbon emissions and the impacts of cattle production. I'd like to almost flip that script around. If you look across the Great Plains, Intermountain West, where the vast majority of beef in the United States is produced, it's 80+%, 85% of a cow's life cycle for beef production is going to be on grass. That ecosystem, that biome, that landscape, it's the headwaters of the country's biggest rivers. It's home to tens of millions of Americans. It's about rural vibrancy and community cohesion. The thread that binds that all together, that ecosystem is bound together by grazing. You remove the cow from that landscape, the whole landscape unravels. We don't necessarily think about the rangelands, and particularly in semi-arid areas, as a carbon sink, but it's a massive carbon reservoir. When you remove the cow, you remove the economic value that landowner is looking for other values. More often than not, it's going to be converted to other uses, such as row crop. As soon as you turn the soil, all that carbon is released in the atmosphere. So what we at JBS, we want to actually refocus on how, in some cases, almost flip the script, where instead of viewing the cow as this mobile, like oil derrick, belching out gas all the time, it's actually an indicator of species. Where you have a profitable, healthy, vibrant ranch, you actually have an intact biome. You have an ecosystem where you have landscape for hundreds of obligate species. You have a vibrant rural economy and rural community. And you have a food system that landscape, by and large, isn't really useful for human food production. So we're actually turning that landscape in terms of overall boosting food security and rural economic welfare. So that's, again, it's part of a more nuanced, sophisticated conversation we want to have, is that it's our interest to keep those working landscapes intact, economically profitable and viable, and it has so many other benefits that then flow out of that landscape, not just beef production, but also for broader environmental quality and economic good.
From what I've seen, when we look at nature, it provides the solutions that we're looking for. I work in product circularity, and we're always trying to figure out end of life for like a product. And my company, we deal a lot with plastic, PET type material, and we're always trying to figure out how can we find something at the end of life. And we had a conversation recently of we just have to look at nature, because nature really regenerates itself over time, and nature really provides this cycle that we can look at in our own products. So that's kind of the next thing I wanted to talk about is, sustainable land use and deforestation prevention, because, as we know with big industry, deforestation can be pretty prevalent with a lot of different industries. So my question would be, how does JBS look at, land usage and deforestation and look to combat, deforestation and make sure that the land that's being used is being sustainable?
So let me first start with, I think, the albatross in the room, which is deforestation, right? And it is absolutely a huge concern. And it's something that our company oftentimes get associated with. One, to be clear, JBS does not own any farms or ranches, whether in Brazil, United States, Australia, anywhere.
Right.
We purchase cattle either directly from the producer or from auction barns or feed yards. So we're not out there running chainsaws, cutting down trees or converting native vegetation. In fact, in Brazil, we have very robust policies in place around it being very crystal clear. In the Amazon biome, it's 100% deforestation-free commitment by the end of this year. Not just legal versus illegal deforestation. It's 100% very clear policy. We will not have any part of our supply chain associated with deforestation. Behind the policy, then, we have a multi-layered approach. So first, it's around monitoring. We have a very sophisticated satellite monitoring system where over time, we've done direct business with over 70,000 ranchers just in Brazil alone. We are daily monitoring their operations for any kind of deforestation event. So if there's a detection, there were trees there yesterday, not here today, that ranch gets automatically flagged in our system, and our cattle buyers that day cannot load cattle. You're blocked in our system. We are monitoring a land area over 610,000 square kilometers, 3 times the size of the United Kingdom. Put that in American terms, that's greater than the size of Texas, Oklahoma combined. Okay, it's a huge land area we're monitoring. Beyond monitoring, then we're also enhancing the transparency of the system. So we have a dual approach here. One, we've launched one of the largest animal ID, animal traceability programs in the Amazon biome. We're very proud to be partnering with the state of Pará, where the governor of Pará has launched a cattle integrity program. We're partnering with his administration and with other key actors in the industry to start tagging animals and put in place a mandatory animal ID program in the heart of the Amazon. We've also built a transparency platform where we're starting to track and trace cattle absent having a national animal ID program, our own animal traceability program. But coming back to economics, the most important component of this, that you can do all the defense you can, but you're still going to have leakage, if you will. You're still going to have bad actors or folks that are doing unfortunate management on their lands. Or there are regions of Brazil where they're legally allowed to clear the land and improve the land for economic production. So in those instances, we want to then come back to the economics. And that's really the driver of deforestation. How do we enhance sustainable land use in Brazil? So it's one thing to block. It's another thing, I think, to co-invest. It's one thing to prevent access to your supply chain. We actually want to bring them back in. So JBS has built a network we call green offices. So we have 20 green offices. They're filling this hole in the supply chain. We're here in the United States. A lot of producers are blessed with extension agents or their own private consultants and agronomists and veterinarians, or they have USDA service centers. There isn't that same infrastructure in Brazil. So we're filling that gap. We have 20 green offices where if your farm or ranch is blocked because of some question or concern about deforestation, we can come back in, assess why you're blocked, and then get you a fast track to come back into legal compliance with the Brazilian Forest Code. We get you technical assistance. We get you a forest restoration plan. We get you low-cost capital to help do the reforestation if that's needed. But beyond that, we're also investing in agronomists and consultants to go out and help improve the profitability of your ranch, doing pasture regeneration, nutrient management on the pastures, where you can take very degraded pastures and enhance and boost the productivity. So enhancing yield from 2 to 3 times, which is, again, money back in the pocket of the producer, and therefore reducing the pressure for him to go further and further into the native forest, to clear more land, to maintain kind of his bottom line productivity. Let's restore the graded pastures, which, by the way, is also then enhancing resiliency, helping them withstand drought, extreme rain events much better than ranchers that are not using this kind of more holistic soil health management system. So we're taking a very holistic approach to improving land management, but also really addressing the true drivers of deforestation. We think it is a really comprehensive strategic approach.
Well, I love that. I mean, looking at, someone might be a bad actor, but at the end of the day, they might not know that they were doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. And my next question would be, with education, when you're working with these farmers, let's say in Brazil, how important is education, and how much do you drive education from the get-go when you're partnering with these farmers on things like deforestation, on things like sustainable land use, on things, anything, water conservation, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. How does education play a role in your partnership with these local farmers?
It's critical. And it's actually the most viable and the most scalable approach to education is actually for producers to hear them from their peers. Mm. So we actually create through our green offices and our consulting services, we create farmer networks where it's really peer-to-peer mentoring and sharing. Actually, earlier this afternoon, we had one of our producers here in New York, Ana Paula Silva. She's one of our suppliers in Brazil, and she was sharing her soil health and regenerative ag story and how she went and helped and support with JBS. It just recently hosted 100 farmers on her ranch. So these are her suppliers. So she's starting to propagate and share, really not, I think, kind of more of the ambition. It's more of the hard economics. Here are the practices I'm doing. Here are the results I've seen. Here's where I started along the way. And it's getting those producers who are interested connected to that technical assistance to start them on their journey. It's a huge part of our strategy for not just sharing the news, it's actually sharing the lessons and just coming back to the basics of good farm stewardship, good farm management to boost their productivity and profitability along the way adopting these systems. So yeah, education is a major component of our strategy.
And then looking at this conversation and going back to the beginning, when we start talking about Scope 3 emissions, how they're indirect, looking at your supply chain, looking at, the local farmers. But one other thing that I saw in your ESG report or sustainability report, I don't know what y'all call it exactly, but it is that you've committed to be net zero by 2040. So I would ask, what is your plan to get to that point?
Mm-hmm.
Is this with a collection of different things to get to net zero? Are we talking about carbon offsets? Are we talking about what exactly are we talking about? Because this is Scope 3 emissions. And I guess I'm just curious about how you get there.
Yeah, it's a huge ambition.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, sometimes it feels like we perhaps bit off a little bit more than we could chew.
Yeah.
And we've been challenged on that, I assure you. To us, the intent was ambition, and it was sort of not just a moonshot, an earth shot, right? How do we catalyze in our place in supply chain, where on a daily basis, we're sourcing from literally hundreds of thousands of producers globally across hundreds of millions of hectares of land, connecting to tens of thousands of customers and tens of millions of consumers. So we're this really interesting node. And so this net zero ambition, we have 6 pillars. So first, and I've talked a lot about it, it's live animal. So that's going to be a significant part of our Scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions. The second biggest part of the second pillar is feed and forage. Those two together are about 80% of our global footprint. If we just are addressing a whole host of different interventions and levers across those 2 pillars, we're a long ways down the tracks. The third is going to be around circular economy. You mentioned this in your own operation. We're doing a ton on transforming waste, what would traditionally go to landfill, transforming into consumer goods, into pharmaceuticals, but also critically in energy. So everything from tallow for sustainable aviation fuel, renewable natural gas, cogen of electricity from our biodigesters. We're doing a range of different renewable energy solutions, which are good for our operations, but also then selling that as a revenue source. We're looking at logistics optimization. We're looking at material sourcing and packaging. So it's really across the whole vector of different ways we touch the supply chain, above us and below us. We have a very concrete plan of action across these 6 pillars with like a playbook of different levers we can pull. Comes back to economics, where how do we then partner with our customers? We're also, by the way, have similar kind of net zero ambitions and goals. It's got to be a supply chain solution. So it's not just one company co-investing. It's a series of supply chain partners and critically public sector, like here in the United States, but also in Brazil and Australia. It's a public-private partnership to co-invest in the education, the technical assistance, the research and development, and most critically, the boots on the ground capacity to go work with farmers and ranchers to help coach and advise and help them with the practice adoption.
Yeah, I don't think people really understand, when they see a net zero ambition like this, like from JBS Foods, I mean, it's so difficult. I mean, when you're talking about, like you said, hundreds of suppliers that you're having to work with to figure out
hundreds of thousands.
Or hundreds of thousands. Yeah, my fault. Hundreds of thousands.
Maybe tens of millions, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a lot.
It's crazy, right? It's crazy. And you've got to work with all of them to figure out, okay, how can we drive things down? How can we do things the right way? It's so complex, so complicated. And people can see a net zero commitment, but they don't really understand everything that goes behind it. It's just crazy.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just on the material side. So setting aside grain, livestock, just on materials, just all the products that are part of our supply chain. Globally, we have 70,000 individual companies we source from. Okay. So when a company takes on this ambition, it's easy to take pot shots and cheap shots about, is this fake news?
Yeah.
Okay. I get the concern, but I think people really need to internalize the size and scale and the complexity of a supply chain that spans continents. And it's a really complex discussion. And this is why I'm really trying to, I think, synthesize and distill it back. It comes back to economics and where you can align self-interest, but also with productivity and profitability with your supply chain and with your customers. That's where you start to get the synergies and the co-investment and movement.
Well, we can't thank you enough for coming on today. I think for everyone listening, next time you go to the grocery store, your local supermarket, think about where that food came from, because a lot of times we're on autopilot when we're picking up food, but they're so complex.
I 100% agree. Thank you very much. And when your listeners go to the supermarket, whether they're buying produce, protein, dairy, despite the rhetoric, there's a family farm behind that. there's a family that puts their heart and soul and passion into growing that food, and they're part of the consumer. Then can be part of that locally sourced approach to food. It doesn't always have to just come from your zip code. You're contributing to the agricultural supply chain in your community, in your state, and your region of the country. And so it's important to just, I think, appreciate the hard work of men and women who make a living from the land for our benefit. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yep.